I had my first degree in mechanical engineering. Second degree also I had in mechanical engineering, and I went to Chennai. That time it used to be Madras. So I did it in IIT Madras, and from there, for 3 years, I worked in a computer company in New Delhi. And then from there, I went to Canada to do my PhD, and that's the first time I encountered food. And before that, food was just for me that mom would cook and we would eat. So I did my PhD in food process engineering, and then I worked 1 year with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and they have the research center. And then from there, I came back to Middle East, worked as a faculty in National University in Muscat, Oman. And after working few years, I went back to US in Washington State University. And that's where I have been from last 10 years. With this, now I'm going to just start. As I said, you can feel free to stop me in between. You can raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Okay? Okay, let's get started. So, why we thought that we would have course in food processing technologies and including packaging as well. So, if you really see foods to an engineer, it appears that most of the food after harvesting fruits and vegetable, or even you have animal-based products, they are inherently unstable, which means that there are some microbial, chemical, biochemical and physical changes continue to occur. And if you want to keep them longer time, then you need to do something. So in order to extend the shelf life, food processing and packaging and technologies plays very, very important role. You can preserve the food. You can also have the new food products. So the purpose of food processing is not just preservation always. You can have new food products. Can you think of it, even by looking at the slide, what are the foods which are not as a result or where the purpose was preservation, the purpose was to develop new products? Can you think of it? Any food? Cold drinks. Cold drinks we made with what? What are the ingredients? Water, sugar, carbon dioxide, and some flavoring agent, right? If you take all these individual ingredients individually, we don't have to do anything to keep them. They are stable, right? Take water, gas, sugar, and flavoring agent. You can keep them for several years, right? So we are making the soft drinks, beverages, as a new product. That's food processing. Here we are not doing any preservation. In fact, by combining all together, we can make them kind of unstable, right? But the purpose is new food product development. So food processing is for preservation as well as for the new product development. And of course, many times when we are doing preservation, basically we are extending the shelf life. And we are extending by controlling the deterioration of certain factors, which tend to spoil or lower the shelf life. So before we really start thinking of any food processing technologies or packaging technologies, this is important for us to know what causes the deterioration in the food, okay? Even if we do food processing technology, we look at the deterioration, what happens in fresh fruits, vegetable, or animal-based product. But once you process and then package them, the deterioration still continues. You slow down, but you don't completely stop, right? If we are able to completely stop, then we will be able to keep the food forever. But as you know, that doesn't happen. So then we look what causes the deterioration during storage and see whether packaging can play any role to slow down this deterioration. Again, you can never completely stop, you can just slow down. And more you slow down, better you get the life or shelf life. So it is important for us to understand this food quality deterioration before processing, what are those factors, and also during storage. So that brings us our first topic. Before we look at any food processing or packaging technology, we will look at it into so what are the deteriorative reactions in food. And we look, as I said, from both point of view. Processing point of view, where processing can contribute to limit this deterioration, or where packaging can contribute. So if you really look, what are the major causes of food deterioration? In first group, I have put all together, these are the microorganisms or organisms, such as bacteria, yeast, molds, and so on, or biochemical changes which happens from enzymes. In the second group, and these deterioration factors in fresh fruits, vegetable, and meat, animal-based product, at large extent you can control using processing. And once you process, as you are storing, some of the deterioration could happen due to moisture or dryness. What do we mean by moisture? You can have a gain of moisture, or you have a loss of moisture. What would be the example of these food products where you could have a gain of moisture or loss of moisture? If you have a low moisture product, such as the chips and biscuits, you give two examples, because they are low moisture, you will like to maintain low moisture, so you don't want any moisture gain. But in some product, you are looking to avoid the moisture loss, not the gain, but to reduce the moisture loss. And what would be the example of fresh fruits, which are high in moisture? In order to maintain their quality, you want to maintain the high moisture. Oxygen is one of the factors. Why oxygen would be a factor? If you have products, you have lipids, it can react with the oxygen. In some cases, light could be a factor. It is known that some of the nutrient can get and deteriorate, or you can reduce the quantity by acting with the light. And in many times, most places, packaging can an important role to minimize these external stresses on your product. Food products could be subjected to heat and cold during handling or storage, and that can also affect the quality. In most cases, it is the maintaining of the environmental condition could help, or you want to avoid raise of temperature or lowering the temperature of this product to avoid any deterioration. Whether processing would help, we are talking about this product which is already processed, or you're not doing any processing. So sometimes packaging could help to mitigate the environmental factors such as a low temperature or high temperature. What would be the example where you can make use of the packaging to reduce the impact of temperature change in the environment? For example, if you have fish, fresh fish, how do we move around fish? It could be frozen. If it is frozen, that's fine. But if you want to sell the fresh fish, you usually keep over the ice to maintain the low temperature. And if you are shipping fish with the ice from one location to another location, while the environmental temperature is 25 degrees C and plus, right? So your ice would melt. Then you would lose you would allow fish temperatures to go up. So how do we move around? We put enough polystyrene boxes, right, to mitigate the environmental temperature effect. So you would be able to maintain ice as ice for sufficient period of time. So you could make use of the packaging to temporarily avoid the temperature change. Eventually, that ice would melt. It will not be forever. But then for a short period of time, you could make use of the packaging to reduce the impact of the temperature. And of course, with time, everything will get eventually spoiled. So food may suffer from biochemical, chemical, biological, and physical damage. And if it is, then it can affect its shelf life. So it is important for us to identify what those reactions or factors are, and we'll go one at a time. There are several. We will be able to cover most of them in this lecture, but not all, and see whether processing or packaging can help to minimize these changes due to these certain factors. So first factor is the control of microorganisms. So if you have fresh produce, fruits, vegetable, or meat-based product, they can be spoiled by microorganisms. Where do these microorganisms come from? From the atmosphere, from the environment. So as you slaughter the meat or catch the fish, or you harvest the fruits and vegetable from the garden or from orchard, then they come in contact with soil or air, and you would have these microorganisms which will be present on the food. They are some pathogens, means they could have health-related problems if you happen to consume them, or you have the spoilage type microorganisms. To overcome this, we use some thermal processes where we have application of heat. Either we reduce the lower level of microorganisms which are present on the food, or we completely eliminate. And the example of some of the thermal processes are canning, aseptic processing and packaging, ohmic heating, microwave, and so on. Are you familiar with all these processes? Okay, so my next question is now, what is the difference between canning and aseptic processing? In both cases you use heat, but what is the difference? Okay, let's have one at a time. Who's going to, you raise your hand? So somebody was saying from here. So what is the difference between canning and aseptic processing?
Commercial sterilization.
No, difference between canning and aseptic processing.
Sir, in the cane, first we put raw materials and then we sterilize the whole environment. But in aseptic packaging, we first sterilize the raw material and then we aseptically fill it into already sterilized bottles.
That's correct. So in one case, you sterilize package and food together. In other case, you sterilize them separately, treat them separately, and bring together in a aseptic environment. What is ohmic heating? Correct. In conventional heating, you make use of the steam or hot water, but in case of ohmic heating, you allow to pass current through the food, and as we pass current through the metal, if it has a resistance or if it has a electrical resistance, then that resistance will convert into heat, and that will allow food to heat, and that heat you utilize to reduce the microbial load. So rather than having use of steam or hot water, you are making use of electricity. And in case of a microwave, you are using magnetron to generate electromagnetic energy, and then that passes through the food, and then you allow it to heat. In case of a non-thermal processes, as it says that we don't make use of heat, we make use of other physical stresses to kill the microorganisms. We have irradiation, X-rays, UVC light, high hydrostatic pressure, pulse electric field, ultrasound, and so on. So as I said, we don't make use of heat, we make use of some other physical stresses. Why scientists and engineers were interested not to use heat?
It causes micro texture,
Correct. So scientists thought, as heat kills the microorganisms, it also affects the food sensory attributes. So let's try some other physical stresses to see whether we are able to eliminate the microbes and we are still able to keep the sensory quality. So in this short course, there are some lectures which would cover some of these technology, if not all. But the mechanism of preservation is the control of microorganisms by inactivating them on whatever physical stresses we have, whether heat, pressure, voltage, electricity, and so on. But in each of these technology, the mechanism of destruction of those microorganisms could be different. So as we are going through each of these technology, we will bring it out what are the mechanism of destruction of these microbes in those stress environment. There is other way of controlling the microorganisms rather than inactivate or killing them. We approach from management of water. What I mean management of water is, for example, in case of a freezing, what happens in case of freezing? Water gets converted to ice. And then what happens to microbes? Most of the microbes are actually killed, but some do survive. But then the condition is such that that water is actually not available for them, and the temperatures are so low that they do not multiply. So we get the shelf life extension. But as you all know that we are still cautious that some microorganisms do survive, and during thawing, if you keep it for a long period of time, they can find enough opportunity to regrow and multiply. So that's why many times food safety problem happens with the frozen food, actually not during freezing and frozen storage, it's actually during thawing. What happens in case of drying? You are removing most of the water from your food material, and you are not having this water available for microbes to grow. So this way you have the preservation. So you're not really targeting any physical stress to kill the microbes. You are just managing the state of water so that it is not available either by converting into ice or by removal from your food product, and you provide the shelf life extension and you do the preservation. So let's say some of the quality changes which happens during storage. These quality changes such as texture, flavor, color, appearance, nutritive value, and so on. And I have given some of the undesirable changes which happens, which are corresponding to that quality attribute. For example, for texture, if you have loss of water holding capacity, toughening, softening, or solubility, that affects the texture of your product. Or if you allow oxygen to react with your food product, then you can have the rancidity, and then you can have the off flavor. So during storage, then you can identify certain packaging to maintain these quality attribute. So if the product quality is affected by oxygen, then you select the packaging which can minimize the diffusion of oxygen from environment into the package. Some of the changes in fresh produce, either fruits, vegetable, or even animal-based product could happen due to enzymes. And as all you know, enzymes are complex proteins. These enzymes are naturally present in our food materials because they can regulate the biochemical processes, but they are very important in terms of defining the quality. These enzymes by themselves do not participate or consumed by the reaction, but they can act as a catalyst. They can accelerate the rate of chemical reactions. They tend to lower the energy of activation energy. So it's very easy. When enzymes are present, the chemistry goes very fast, and you could have a lot of changes in terms of the sensory or the other textural changes or food quality changes in food product. And interestingly, they are very, very selective or specific as well. They target particular component in a food. It could be attacking proteins, it could be attacking lipids, and so on. Of course, you can make good uses of enzymes, such as in case of cheese, but in most of the time, we have kind of a problems with these enzymes. So we try to, how do we control then these enzymes? How can we control these enzymes? Basically, you heat or even non-thermal stresses such as UVC light or high pressure or pulse electric feed. They all can inactivate the enzymes. Does packaging can help to control the enzymes? How?
Oxygen barrier or like to heat in heat regulations, it will be important.
So if you have these enzymes in fresh produce, you can use physical stresses to inactivate them. Let's say if you do not completely inactivate, if there is some residual enzymes there, then during storage, if any of the external factors are what? Light, oxygen. If there is any moisture which can accelerate the enzyme activity, then you can make use of packaging to block these external factors, right? For example, if you have a dry product, it has a minimal enzymatic activity, and enzymatic activity in that low moisture products such as milk powder or any other dry products could accelerate if it can gain the moisture, because enzyme activity is dependent on the moisture available in the food. So packaging can help to reduce the moisture gain. So this is how packaging could help to control the enzymatic activities. So by processing you kill them, but for packaging you can control the external environment, so that if those external environment is somehow accelerating the enzymatic activity, then you can control through packaging. Yeah, so that's what I have here, external factors such as temperature, change in the substrate, for example, oxygen or water activity, which is basically gain of moisture, and so on. So that's where packaging can help to control the enzymatic activities. So if you really see in food, other than the biochemical changes which is happening due to enzyme, there's a lot of other chemistry happens. It is listed here, all those non-enzymatic browning, lipid oxidation, lipid hydrolysis, and so on. Most of this you would have studied in food chemistry, right? So I'm not going to go really all these one by one to explain, but we will pick a couple of them and we see how they can affect the shelf life or quality of the food, and how processing or packaging can help to control these chemical reactions. So let's say non-enzymatic browning, mostly it happens in low moisture products such as dried or concentrated food. Food chemists have been studying the non-enzymatic browning from last 3-4 decades, and a lot of advances has been done to understand the chemistry of Maillard reaction, which is non-enzymatic browning. As you all know that it involves the reducing sugar and amino acids, and usually requires some level of heat, and that it can turn the product brown, and it can reduce also its nutritive value. And temperature, moisture, and alkaline condition can affect the rate of non-enzymatic browning reactions, and actually it's shown here how the enzymatic non-enzymatic reaction can affect by the water activities. So if you have to control the non-enzymatic browning, so non-enzymatic browning we are talking for the already concentrated product, which has a low moisture product. So processing has been done. So now we are talking about this non-enzymatic browning during storage. And if the moisture is one of the factors is affecting the non-enzymatic browning, then how can you control the moisture? Using packaging. So you have the high water vapor barrier packaging, so you do not want to allow moisture gain during the storage. So you really want very, very high water vapor barrier packaging. So this is how packaging can control deteriorative reactions such as non-enzymatic browning. Oxidation is other frequently talked about in terms of the chemical reaction in the food product, and this is mostly happens in the presence of oxygen, and this oxygen could react with the fats, oils, or protein. Again, the free radical chemistry has been studied more than half a century. It's very well understood. The reactions happens during the oxidation. So as it says that you have the even if you have molecular level oxygen present, and that can also continue to have the lipid oxidation in your food. That especially happens with your polyunsaturated fatty acids or phospholipids which are present in your product. And this whole oxidation process happens in 3 stages. You have initiation of reaction, propagation, and then eventual termination. And then it can have a lot of undesirable flavor or aroma. Somebody gave example of chips. So for example, if you have chips which are usually fried, so you have presence of oil there. In terms of the packaging, what kind of packaging we use for these chips? So what kind of atmosphere we have?
Nitrogen.
It's a nitrogen flash. What kind of packaging we have? It's a aluminum foil packaging, which is perfect barrier to oxygen. So this is how you are able to maintain its shelf life. And if you happen to open this, then product will come in a contact with oxygen and chemistry will switch on. And then it takes some time, and if you don't able to consume all the chips, you leave it for some period of time, and you could easily detect the off flavor. And this reaction is actually enhanced by light, local oxygen concentration. So that's how you minimize the change in oxygen by having the very, very high oxygen barrier packaging. And you also avoid the light because your packaging, which is metal-based packaging, does not allow light penetration. So you would not really see any chips being packaged, especially coming from the good companies, food companies, in plastic films. You would always have the aluminum-based foil packaging. And it says the reaction follows zero-order kinetics. What does it mean, zero-order kinetics? Correct, it's independent of concentration. So that brings the question, what are the other reaction which is depend upon the concentration? Sorry? Yes, it's the first order, but what kind of chemical reactions are first order? Enzymatic reaction or the microbial inactivation. That also follows the first order chemical reaction. So for example, in case of first order, let's say you are familiar with the D value in microbes, thermal inactivation of microbes. If D value is 10 minutes at particular temperature, it means whatever the concentration of bacteria you have, you are destroying 90% in that time of heating. So if you have 100, you destroy 90%, big from 100 to 10. But then next D value or time, you will destroy from 10 to 1. So you are destroying in that second D value, you are destroying 9. In the first D value, you are destroying 90. But in case of a lipid oxidation, it does not depend upon the concentration. You are consuming the amount of lipids is same with time. Yeah, so in terms of the mathematics, so this is what you have, the zero order reaction. So how does packaging can help in terms of lipid oxidation? You can, if you provide the perfect barrier to oxygen, right, then you would avoid the lipid oxidation. And of course, if it is flushed, that there is no oxygen in the head space, because during packaging, even if it is a high oxygen barrier film, but if you didn't flush with nitrogen, if whatever residual oxygen is there in head space, that will continue to have the reaction, and that would limit the shelf life of your product. So you would flush. But let's say that's example in case of chips. We do not package all the low moisture product or lipid based product always in aluminum foil, right? Many times we do use polymeric based packaging, which allows some transmission of oxygen from environment into the package, right? So do you know how do we then select those packaging? Sorry? Oxygen transmission. So for example, once we know the lipid oxidation chemistry, that as how much oxygen is being consumed per unit time, right? And then by sensory evaluation, we know that how much oxygen, if it reacts with your lipids in your product, would produce the off flavor. So we know that for a given unit mass of food product, so how much oxygen you want to allow, and this is how you would determine the shelf life, right? If you allow very little oxygen penetration, for example, in this equation, as you can see, the Q is the amount of gas you are allowing to transmit from outside environment into your package. That depends upon the permeability of your oxygen permeability of your film, surface area of your package. This is the time, this is the thickness, and this is the partial pressure difference. So if inside of your package, even if you completely flush with nitrogen, initially the partial pressure of oxygen would be 0 or close to 0 because there is no oxygen. But the outside you would have 21% oxygen in your environment, so that can give you the delta P, the drive-in potential for oxygen to penetrate into your package. And based on that, you can find out how much amount of gas is going through a given time, okay? And then based on that, you can find whether that oxygen is sufficient to create off flavor and have the rancid flavor for your product, and then that is the end of shelf life. But you can do the reverse calculation. For example, you know that this amount of oxygen which is getting into the package would limit my shelf life. And then if you want very high shelf life, then you can put very high amount of shelf life, whatever you are looking for that. Then it can tell you what kind of oxygen permeability of the film you are looking, and that can help you to select appropriate film for packaging of your product. So this is how you can make use of the knowledge of packaging to extend the shelf life or determine the shelf life for a given film. So either way you can do that. Other frequent quality changes which is important for the food product is color. Why color is important for us? Sensory characteristics. Does it give the nutrient? Some of the pigments, they give you color and they also have a nutritive value. But change in color is not always directly proportional to nutritive value, right? But still color is important. Why? Because we are used to see some of the colors in food product, and it appears to be very attractive to us, and then if you don't see that color, many times probably will not even buy that product. There was an experiment done in US where one ketchup company, probably you must have heard, Heinz, right? Heinz ketchup. So how do you buy the ketchup? It's in a transparent bottle. Either it's a glass bottle or plastic bottle. And it is known that there is a change in the color of the tomato ketchup due to light. So Heinz company thought, let's develop a packaging which will not allow light, UV, not UV light, visible light to transmit and into the package and then change the color. So they came up with the non-transparent bottle that gives the higher shelf life to that tomato ketchup. But they couldn't market because people have experience of buying ketchup when they see the color. If they don't see what kind of a color of the ketchup is, they do not buy. So color is associated with some sort of a quality of that product as well. So as it says in here, it is important in terms of the cultural, geographical, and from the social aspect point of view. The color to many food product is provided by their natural pigment. It could be chlorophyll, beta-carotene, or lycopene, or anthocyanin. There are a variety of color pigments. They can be induced by heat, especially in case of chlorophyll, which is a green pigment. As all you know, it is involved in the photosynthesis. It is affected by heat and acid, and photooxidation is known to change color in green beans, and I gave example for ketchup as well. So how can we make use of process or package to maintain that color? Blanching. So if you are doing any thermal processing, for most cases, if you do before canning, you do some level of blanching to fix the color. Or when we do thermal processing, in thermal processing we have application of heat, which we can use any temperature. So basically we approach in terms of the pasteurization or sterilization some sort of a temperature and time combination to achieve certain level of pasteurization or sterilization, right? So what engineers do, you study the change in the color or color kinetics as a result of thermal processing, and based on the time temperature combination you see that what is the color kinetics, and then you do the optimization of process. You know, some color where temperature threshold is more important than the time, while in other cases time is more important than the temperature. So by having this knowledge, we can optimize the process to maintain the or minimize the change in the color of in your processed product. But if light is involved in oxidation or change in color, then we can select appropriate packaging to block the visible light. The other color pigment is hemipigment, which is usually available in meat. So you have these pigments, myoglobin, oxymyoglobin, and metamyoglobin, that is affected by the for example, in case of meat, as you all know, some amount of oxygen is important to maintain the color of the meat, because it forms, you know, a small amount of oxygen can form the kind of a brown pigment, brown color, which is the metamyoglobin, and that is still attracted to us, and then we tend to buy meat if it is a brown in color. But if you completely eliminate the oxygen, then it forms a purple color, and you will have myoglobin pigment formed in there. So when you do the modified atmosphere packaging of meat, you do not really select the oxygen property of the film in a manner that it completely blocks. It still allows some level of oxygen, because that helps in maintaining the color. Anthocyanin, it's present in some of the fruits and vegetables. In terms of the fruits, you have a lot of berries, blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, and they contain different types of anthocyanins. And in terms of vegetables, you have the purple cauliflower. Do you see here purple cauliflower?
Yes.
Yeah, some places you do see, and you have the beetroot, you have the purple potato, they have the anthocyanins. And the stability of anthocyanin depends upon the pH. and it can react with the metal and change in color. So in terms of the packaging, we tend to select non-metal packaging for the product which contains the anthocyanin. So if you have metal packaging, we want to avoid the contact, then you would have the plastic lining in those packaging, because otherwise it would react with your product and change the chemistry and change the color. But these anthocyanins are also heat sensitive. So due to heat, you could have some inactivation of anthocyanin. And again, if you want to maintain the color of those anthocyanins, and of course anthocyanin also provide the nutritive value, so then again you would optimize your process condition in terms of the time temperature. If it is a thermal process, if it is a high pressure process, then you would optimize the, again, level of pressure and time. And if it is the pulse electric field process, then again you would optimize the voltage and the number of pulses. So whatever process you are using, you would study the inactivation kinetics of those anthocyanins with respect to the processing conditions. And then once you know the kinetics, then you can optimize the process condition based on those kinetics. Yeah, this is another example of carotenoid, which are responsible to give red and yellow color in orange or carrots and so on. These are a class of hydrocarbon compounds, and their main causes of deterioration is oxidation, and their rate of deterioration also depends upon light and temperature. So again, packaging can help to minimize the exposure to light, and in terms of the temperature, then again you would optimize your process in terms of the temperature exposure. Or sometimes some of these carotenoids which are most sensitive to temperature, then you tend to select non-thermal processes to minimize the change in carotenoids. Then you have other variety of pigments such as flavonoid, proanthocyanins and tannins and so on, which are present in different fruits and vegetables. Again, in terms of the processing and packaging, you would study that how sensitive those are to physical stresses, whether it's coming from the heat, coming from pressure, coming from electricity or voltage or light and so on. And depending upon their sensitivity with respect to physical stresses, you will study the kinetics, and then you would select appropriate processing conditions or package to minimize the changes in these pigments. The other important changes which happens in food product is the flavor, which is the combination of smell and taste. So smell, we have the specialized cells of the olfactory in the nasal cavity which can detect what kind of flavor we are smelling. And also on the tongue, we have the taste buds, which can also detect the flavor in terms of the sweetness, sourness, saltiness, and bitterness, and so on. And these flavor compounds sometimes are generated into fruits and vegetable by the reaction of enzymes with the fatty acids and so on. If you could have the oxidative breakdown in fatty acid, that can also lead to your aromas. And in case of fats and oil, you would have the oxidation. That's a reaction between aldehydes and ketones. These are the most volatile compound as a result of oxidation. So from the sensory perspective, these are very important from the quality point of view. And for example, in case of orange, you have 20 different types of volatile compounds, which all together gives you the orange flavor. And here it is giving example that, in orange juice, the amount of flavor present is actually 450 ppm. So you can see that the amount in terms of the mass is extremely small. But then if you lose a small amount of those flavor compounds, such as 20%, then people can perceive that it's not a fresh orange juice anymore. I'm sure you must have consumed the processed orange juice, and you must have also consumed the fresh orange juice. So you would find that processed orange juice doesn't taste as good as the processed orange juice because we lose significant amount of flavors during processing. So are you aware any of the method where we could improve this flavor retention in orange juice? Encapsulation. So how does the encapsulation works? That's the external addition. But if we had to have the natural one, are you aware of any process where we are able to maintain? Of course, it's extremely expensive process, and not all food companies. Ultrafiltration is a non-thermal process, so that can, has a minimal effect on the flavor. What else? Of course, if you use high pressure process, so these are the non-thermal processes. They are becoming popular, but I'm not sure whether, do you find any pasteurized orange juice in Indian market which are gone through ultrafiltration or high pressure process? Not in India. Actually, even in the US, we do not have as many. We do have some. For example, Starbucks has come up with the pasteurized orange juice, which has gone through high pressure process. Correct. So you have either a sterilized one. I'm not sure. Do you get the pasteurized orange juice here? Okay. So for example, in Europe or some of the developed country, including US, Japan, you do get pasteurized orange juice of extremely high quality, but it's very, very expensive. Compared to, of course, consumer is still able to afford, but it's relatively expensive compared to the sterilized orange juice, for example. So the way they do what they call is aroma recovery process. So you do pasteurization using heat, so you inactivate enzymes, you reduce a little bit microbial load. But during this pasteurization process, actually a lot of these volatile compounds, they come off from your orange juice. Right? So what they do, they collect this vapor, because this pasteurization is done in a closed vessel. So you collect this vapor because when you heat, these volatile compounds evaporate. So they come into headspace, they collect this vapor, and of course, they only recover the useful compounds, so they know what is the condition for the condensation. So they recover this volatile by doing the condensation at different temperatures, and then they remix these volatile compound into orange juice. So this whole process called aroma recovery process, by which they add, and that pasteurized orange juice has as good, if it is not exactly like a fresh orange juice, but it's very, very close to fresh orange juice. So this is how you could manipulate the process and maintain the high quality, high sensory quality in your processed product. Yeah, so it says the thermal processing can reduce the flavor, as I gave the example. But other than thermal processing, you also have the absorption of this flavor or the permeation through the plastic packaging. For example, when they started having this pasteurization of orange juice or some other fruit juices, they started packaging into the polymeric based packaging, and they found during storage they tend to lose the flavor, and then they later learned that some of these volatile compounds either absorbed by the polymeric films, or these polymeric films, because they are inherently amorphous, they have some permeation to these compounds, so they just allow it to go through these film, and this is how you have the reduction in the concentration of volatile compound. So in order to maintain that, then you should have extremely high barrier material for packaging of these pasteurized product. So you could use glass or metal, but not the polymeric film. But if you are using polymeric film, then you have to make sure that they do not allow the permeation of these volatile compound. But if you store in a glass, then light, if it is participates in change in the volatile compound, then again glass would not help. But if light is not participating, then the glass will be able to maintain these volatile compounds in your product. Or you could use the metal-based packaging, which is foil. Then that can also maintain the flavor profile in your processed product. Light is also in one of the external factors which can influence or change the quality of your product. It can also affect the nutritive value. And light, we are basically talking about either UV or visible light range, because that's what it is there in the environment. And as you can see from some of these photographs or pics, that change in the color, as you can see, there's an influence of light during storage. Other than the meat, you have dairy products such as especially ketchup, especially yogurt, where you have the problem with the light. You also have problem with the ketchup, it can get darkened. You have beer, which can be affected by light. So how does processing or packaging can help to nullify or have the less influence of light? So basically light we are talking during storage, not really during processing. During processing, you have the processing, especially enclosed chamber, so that you would have minimized the effect of light. But because the storage time is much larger than the process time, then you want to consider what are the factors or how packaging can actually minimize the effect due to light. So then you would have packaging either like metal, which will not allow light to transmit through it, or paper, which will also not allow. But as I said many times, consumer would like to see the product before buying. So glass and polymeric packaging is more desirable, and more than glass, because glass is fragile. There's a lot of liability to it, high density material. Then plastic films are actually choice of packaging material, and plastic packaging does allow light transmission. So you could one of the options that you could incorporate some of the chemicals which can absorb UV light, at least if not visible. So then whatever changes could happen due to UV light, then you can minimize those changes. What would be the other option to minimize the changes due to light, and at the same time you want consumer to see the product?
There can be see-through portion somewhere on the side.
Correct. So you could have some window, like entire bottle or the package, whole surface area doesn't have to be exposed to the light. If consumer wants to see the color, consumer doesn't have to see product from whole surface area. You can cover most of the surface area through labels. Let's say you put for example here you have this kind of label. You could increase and allow very small opening for consumer to see, and the other area you could block the light by having the paper-based labeling. So this way you can minimize the changes. Other quality changes, especially during storage, which happens either gain of moisture or loss of moisture. If you have the high moisture product, you would like to maintain that level of moisture to have those quality in that product. And the example would be fresh produce, fruits, vegetable, or meat. So you want to minimize the moisture loss. And if you have dehydrated product, then you want to avoid the moisture gain to have the influence on quality. What would be problem if we have high moisture product, and if you lose a little bit of a moisture, you think it's going to change the quality? Can you give me an example where if you lose small amount of water and it would change the quality of product? Shrinkage. What product? Fruits and vegetables. Do you know what level of moisture loss we will lose, then we will have shrinkage? Let's say 10-15%. But what if I lose only 3% moisture and I don't see any quality change? Then I can allow 3% of water loss. Can I? So that's the economic loss, because high moisture product, you are not selling only because of its nutritive value, you are selling actually water. So on all fruits and vegetable and even meat product, more than 60% is water. So literally you are selling water. So even actually 1% of water loss is 1% of your profit loss. Actually not really profit, it's the value loss of your product. So you would have seen in especially small businesses who sell vegetables, especially they are not packaged, what do? They keep sprinkling the water over it, so they have the preferential loss of that water which you are spraying on your vegetable rather than its natural water which is present into that vegetables. And especially if they are leafy vegetable which has the larger surface area, so then you could have the larger amount of water loss at the time of selling. Even in few hours you could lose a significant amount of water. So for high moisture product, it's a quality plus also economics. But for low moisture product, why we should worry? If it gains the moisture, of course you will be selling more product, right? Because it's going to gain some mass, so it actually shouldn't be a problem. And some of these practice was actually done intentionally in some industry I know very well here in India at least. Can you think of that, and what would be the problem? Loss of? It could be loss of brittleness. For example, if you had dehydrated crispy products, right? If they gain moisture, then you would have loss of quality, which is as he mentioned, the texture. It can get soggy and you lose the quality. That's very apparent. Can you think of any product where there is a little bit gain of water for the consumer point of view, it will not be noticed any quality change, but still it is a problem? In grains, there's a perfect example. If you have the long storage stability of grains, it should have certain level of moisture content. What level of moisture content? Less than 14%. Why less than 14%?
It is harvested basically that if it increases, there will be microbial contamination.
Correct. Why there will be microbial contamination? Why there will be mold growth? How do we know it has to be 14%? Why not 11%? I'll give you another example. If you have milk powder, right? Do you know what is the moisture content of milk powder? Sorry, how much? It's actually even not that high. It's really about 2%, 1.5 to 2%. So your milk powder is good at 2% or 1.5%. If you have 3-4%, you have a problem. But in case of a grain, it's problem only after 14%, right? Why is it so? It's the water activity. So it is not the amount of water, but it is the water vapor pressure, which is we quantify as a water activity for those dehydrated product, is the actually indicator. So milk powder will have a water activity of less than 0.6, around 1.5 to 2% moisture, and the grains would have water activity of around 0.5, 0.6, around 14% of moisture, right? And we all know that none of the microorganisms would grow, water activity below 0.6. They may still survive some, but they would not multiply and have any, safety issue or a spoilage issue. So this is how we don't want any moisture gain in low moisture product, either from the quality point of view, as it can change the texture, as this is a brittleness, or sometimes safety point of view or a spoilage point of view. And all this is actually learned and presented in this kind of a diagram, which is the water activity versus the chemical reaction in those products. The other quality changes could happen during storage is the migration of package component. So we do this packaging of processed product, whether it's a paper-based packaging or metal-based packaging, glass-based packaging, or polymer or plastic-based packaging. We are thinking, or we have learned that there is some level of migration, depending upon the package, depending upon the product, could happen from package material into food. Because food is in a direct contact with your package during storage. So if some package component, if they migrate into food, what kind of problems we will have? It may affect the safety and quality of your product, right? If these components are not safe to eat, then we have safety problem. Sometimes safety may not be a big issue because those compounds may not be toxic, but then quality could be a problem. You're able to smell. For example, I remember very well when I was very young, we started carrying water from home when I was in elementary school to school. And these water bottles were plastic bottles, and you could literally smell of the plastic. So some of the plastic compound migrated from your bottle into water, and then you could literally smell. Of course, over the year, a lot of research has gone to overcome this problem, so you probably do not, whatever bottle we all have been carrying, you do not really see any migration under the condition of use. Of course, if you abuse, even in those water bottles we carry, you could see some migration. So that could be an issue. And sometimes actually we would like to have some migration, right? Can you think of any example where we want intentional migration? It's in case of active packaging, right? And antimicrobials and antioxidants, right? So sometimes you do incorporate those chemical compounds in your packaging. Why there was an interest in antimicrobial packaging? Why don't we just add into food? Why we worried about?
Reduce the addition of chemical preservatives.
Well, you are, in a way, you are adding. You are just putting, rather than putting directly on the food, you are allowing it on the package, and eventually it will get into food.
Sometimes it actually does not complement the food matrix. It might interfere. And some of the antimicrobials, not all are so very edible. So if you just incorporate them in the packaging, we can control their movement inside the food. And so they're edible.
Yeah, so in some cases you can immobilize those active compounds on the packaging material. Rather than adding into food, you just add into packaging material and immobilize them. You do not allow it to migrate, but they may generate, let's say, volatile, right? And these volatiles may be having antimicrobial activity. So they are not being directly incorporated as a solid substance into your food material. So depending upon the type of antimicrobials, depending upon the type of antioxidant, you could incorporate into the food materials in a manner that you allow it to migrate into food, or you just have the activity generated just from the packaging itself. And also other advantage that you could have a controlled release, right? Even let's say that antimicrobial is safe to consume. If you add into food, you are adding 100% and it can have activity as of few hours or very short period of time. But then if you incorporate it in a packaging, you could have a very controlled release that the amount of antimicrobial needed every day is certain amount, and you allow it that amount of antimicrobial to release from packaging. You do not want to release 100% instantaneously. For example, that idea is also used in pharmaceuticals, right? So you will have, let's say, tablet, if when you consume, you can allow it to break down so slow release in your stomach that you could have that drug effect for several hours rather than it just goes and breaks down. So let's say the headache tablets, instantly it will release the 100%. So for a couple of hours you have no headache, but then again you have the symptoms. So in that case, you could design a tablet where it could release in 6-8 hours rather than releasing all 100% in within few minutes. So similar idea can be used, and it's used in case of packaging, that you could have a controlled release of antimicrobials or antioxidants so that you can have a longer shelf life. So in general, high molecular weight polymer, so that's the packaging made of, does not migrate, but the low molecular additives, they can migrate, and it is important from a regulatory aspect and also from the quality aspect that what components are migrating, and we want to make sure that there is no unintentional migration. And these compounds, in terms of their quantity, is extremely small. It's not just ppm, sometimes it could be ppb, but over the year the synthetic polymer industry has done significant amount of research, so we do not see the level of unintentional migration of any harmful compounds from packaging into food is extremely minimal, and whatever is there we are able to quantify, and it is within the regulatory limits. In fact, any food contact materials, either packaging or any materials you are using in a food industry, is all approved by regulatory agency. For example, in case of Europe, US, it is FDA, and I'm sure India would also have some parallel agency which oversees this kind of a migration. FSI? Yes, okay. So what does it stand for? Okay. Other quality deterioration could happen, especially during storage, is the thermal effects. For example, I mentioned that during storage of, let's say, fish, we are storing over the ice to maintain the temperature, low temperature of the ice to minimize the biochemical changes in the fish. But then if the whole thing is exposed to the atmosphere temperature, then the ice will melt very easily. So then you would have, if you have the polystyrene based packaging, then it can protect from the environmental thermal effects, and then you can extend the shelf life. But then this is very temporary, it's a very short term. We are not talking about weeks and months or years, we are all talking about hours and days. And in whether you use polystyrene or corrugated boxes, how does it help to navigate the thermal effect? Sorry? Correct. So they have very, very low thermal conductivity. Why do they have low thermal conductivity? Because these materials, actually plastic and paper, both are highly conductive to heat or have a significant conductivity to heat, but the air doesn't have conductivity to heat. So in both cases you actually incorporate air. In one case is plastic, in another case is paper, and this air which has a low thermal conductivity, and that creates the insulation in your packaging material, and this way you can minimize the thermal effects. These both materials can also help you to minimize the mechanical source of damage which could happen during handling and transport. So when you ship fruits, vegetable, or other food products from one location to another location, the shipping happens either in plane or train or through trucks, and there are mechanical vibration coming, transmitting to your food product, and that can damage the quality of your product. So you can make use of some of the packaging materials to minimize the mechanical shock. In the previous example, we were looking at the thermal effect, but some of the packaging material can minimize the mechanical vibration effect on your food product. So you see some of these packaging, I'm sure you must have seen here as well. So this can minimize the mechanical source of damage. Pastes also have some problem. In fact, I'm told that they are responsible for 30% of food supply all over the world, and it can also contaminate or affect the nutritive value. It can ruin the appearance of your product. But if it is a processed product or prepared product, then they are packaged very well. Then you do not have really problem with the paste, and especially if you are using metal and glass, then you do not have really paste problem. But if it's a paper and plastic packaging, you could have in some instance problem. So this is all I have for this topic, and if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer now or over the course of next few days. I'm around. If you have any question on this particular topic, I'll be happy to answer.
Sir, in packaging, regarding the partial pressure of oxygen.
Correct.
You said that at some situations the oxygen will be drawn inside.
Correct.
So when the partial pressure of oxygen is inside the packaging is less, then it will withdraw. It will.
Correct. So in most food product where you do not want oxygen inside the package, so the time of packaging itself you would remove. Either you do vacuum packaging or nitrogen flush. And if the package is permeable, then during storage you have the partial pressure difference, and then that will allow oxygen ingress inside the package. And even sometimes you do not, let's say, flush the oxygen, because there are reactive compounds inside the food which will react with the oxygen, and it will reduce the amount of oxygen inside the package. That will reduce the partial pressure, and then it will create the partial pressure difference. So let's say initially, if you do not flush, you have 21% oxygen inside, 21% oxygen outside. So there is no migration. But then if the food is reactive to oxygen, then you would reduce the concentration of oxygen inside as oxygen is being consumed by the food. Then it would create the driving force, and then you will allow oxygen transmission inside the package.
So this will be considered only when the packaging material is oxygen permeable.
Permeable, correct. So
Otherwise, we don't need to.
no, so you would not worry about, let's say, glass or metal packaging. You would worry about only in polymeric packaging. And as you can see, food product around us, if you go to grocery stores where you would have prepared products, a large number of products are packaged actually in polymeric packaging, not in glass and metal, simply because it's less expensive. Polymeric packaging, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of shapes and sizes. In case of glass and metals, mostly you have the cylindrical containers. You do not have a lot of choice there. And the problem with the polymeric packaging is the permeation to gases, which means oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. So that's we need to overcome by increasing its barrier property. If not barrier property, then at least you select in a manner such that it provides the sufficient shelf life which you are looking for.
So polymeric materials in terms of their chemistry is polymers, or the packaging materials chemistry?
Correct. So for example, if you have a lot of different polymers, polyethylene, polypropylene, polyethylene terephthalate, nylon, ethyl valine alcohols, different types of, and these all different packaging. Within each material you have variety of grades, and many times you have multi-layer. They combine different polymeric packaging together, form multi-layer structure. So by different means, we can improve the mechanical properties, thermal properties, and barrier properties of these materials, and design the packaging material which are suitable for given food product.
What about the biodegradable packages? What is the current status in US?
Correct. So there are two types of biodegradable packaging we are talking. One, which is like a edible packaging, which is a biodegradable, of course, but you can consume it. So these are used as a coatings, coatings over fruits, vegetables. For example, apples are naturally coated with the wax to minimize the moisture loss during storage. You could have a coating on almonds, which are rich almonds, and walnuts, which are rich in lipids. So they have the edible coating with some of the hydrocolloids or carbohydrate, which are barrier to oxygen. So this way you can increase the shelf life. But then these edible coatings are carbohydrate based or protein based, which you can consume. So that's the one class of materials which are being used. The other is more biodegradable material, which is like a package, right, which contains your entire product. So biodegradable one could be paper, which we all know, but the paper has a issue in terms of the wettability. So you cannot use paper-based packaging for wet, high moisture product. In terms of the polymers, the PLA, polylactic acid-based packaging, is the one which has been commercially successfully developed and is being used. So in US, chips, Sun Chips by Pepsi, they are using PLA-based bag for their chips, and it provides the same level of shelf life as you would have with aluminum foil. They are also using PLA for as a yogurt containers. So a couple of companies, they are using PLA-based cups for the storage and packaging of yogurt. The big problem with biodegradable based packaging is that we do not have many molecules like synthetic polymer, which can give very, very high thermal, mechanical, and the barrier properties. So we do have some, it has a limited application, but there's a lot of interest from industry, there's a lot of interest within the academia to develop newer biodegradable materials, and research is going on. If you compare to synthetic polymers, we have more than 100 years of research. So whatever plastic you see, it didn't happen overnight. In case of biodegradable packaging, research interest has been only from last 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years. And in compared to synthetic polymers, you could say 1 century, more than a century of effort. So I'm sure it would come, but it will take some time.
Why do we still say these technologies are emerging always?
Correct. So this is the use of the word. Rather than telling the emerging, we should be having more physics-based nomenclature rather than advanced or emerging, because what is emerging today, after 50 years, is not emerging anymore. What is advanced today, after 50 years, it's not advanced anymore. It is conventional. But I guess this is how the market is. You want to catch the attention of the media or people, so you want to use catchy words. So that's how they use. For example, high pressure processing, UV light, or pulse electric field. eventually, when these technologies being worked out or people were doing research, we use this word, emerging technologies, right? But we have been working on this 20, 30 years now, actually. So I think recently when people realize that the choice of word is not probably very, very appropriate, so rather than saying emerging, it's better to classify as non-thermal processing technologies. Yeah.